Welcome to the WorkJoy Jam podcast. I'm your host, Beth Stallwood, founder of Create WorkJoy. In this episode, I talked to the brilliant Simon Arrowsmith, and Simon is a story coach, storyteller, a story producer. He lives and breathes the world of stories. And I don't know about you, but I can't move anywhere online or talk to anybody at the moment without talking about stories. It is so in the minds of people about how do we capture and use stories to help engage people, to help us understand ourselves, to help us connect with other people. And I've asked Simon to come on today to talk about his background, and he's got a really interesting career as well, which is great. And do forgive me when I go off and get excited and ask Simon about 300 questions in one go and then have to start again in asking a single question. I just got a bit too overexcited. And Simon's approach to storytelling, there's some really practical stuff in here that you can really think about. So I really hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to the WorkJoy Jam. Today I am joined by the fabulous Simon Arrowsmith, and I have been looking forward to this conversation for ages. So I'm really pleased to introduce Simon. Simon will introduce himself way better than I could. So Simon, over to you. Tell us a bit about you, your story, how you got to where you are today.
Oh, well, first off, thanks for having me on the podcast. I've been listening to them. Well, I've been slightly more than listening to them, but more about that later. Intriguing. Yeah, so my story, well, I should be really good at telling my story, but I think ironically, I'm not that good at telling my story. I'm good at helping other people tell their story. But when it comes to my own, I sort of go, well. No. Yeah, so I am, I guess, a professional storyteller. Although I don't like that word, storyteller or storytelling. For me, it doesn't seem to work for me because I think there are lots of different ways that story comes into our lives. And so that's what I'm a story shaper, I'm a story coach, I'm a story consultant. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to that. I started my career as I believe other people on this podcast right now did too, in the world of theatre. But I wasn't really cut out for the acting side of it. I just wasn't very good. I didn't go, when people say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I always thought I wanted to be an actor. And it turns out I was really terrible at acting. So that sort of went out the window. So I turned to writing, and I did a lot of written work, and my degrees are sort of in contemporary art, so it's all these sort of mixed media stuff. So I've always had this fascination with how stories work, but also the sort of technical way that stories are pulled together from different and disparate parts of media. So that's how I started. I did work in West End Theatre for a couple of years on the sort of backstage side. But then I got, I liked eating, and I liked food, and I liked having a life. And I wasn't one of those lucky few that could make a particularly good life out of theatre. So I went and got a real job. And it just so happened that my real job managed to get me into the world of comms and learning and development. And so I kind of brought the story world with me, although it took me, I'd say, about 10 years to really, really bring that story training and story world into my communications and development world. And then 10 years ago, I started a company called Grow the People. We set up initially as a training company and to train people into how to use stories in their work. And after about 5 years, more and more our clients were sort of saying, could you come and help us and consult on this and help with our third-party client to actually do the story? So we ended up doing live events, copywriting, content, all story-led, and consultancy, all story-led. And so I ended up being much more of a traditional storyteller, I guess, than I'd set out to be. So I think full circle, I'm kind of achieved what I wanted to achieve in terms of suddenly finding myself as a story person. So that's a very roundabout and not very good way of telling you my story.
I know it. When you started saying about, oh yeah, I should be able to do this because I'm training people to do it, I just sit there thinking, yeah, how hard it is to take our own advice sometimes.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can sit and listen and prompt and coach and help someone and listen. And when I'm hearing someone tell their story, I go, yeah, that bit's not interesting. That bit is really, really good. You want to pull. But when someone's asked me that same question, I'm like, really dull. I don't really have a very good story.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because well, there's so many things to dive into here, and I'm going to dive into all of them. We're going to find time to make it happen.
Okay.
But the first thing I just really want to reflect on there is so many people I talk to think that their stories are really boring, and they think everyone else's story is amazing and really interesting. Yeah. And I have yet to meet anybody, and I speak to thousands of people every year. I have yet to meet anyone who has a story that I am not in some way fascinated by.
Completely. I mean, I completely agree. And well, what's fascinating, you and I met whilst doing work for a sort of third-party company, and we were, and that company, Women Ahead, works with athletes a lot, and I was coaching those athletes on their story, and these are Olympians, and they would come and go, yeah, but my story's not very interesting. I'm like, I beg your pardon.
I know.
What?
I know.
And it's true. It doesn't, and I don't think it really matters unless you're some mad ego-driven actor, performer, or even entrepreneurial business person. I think most people are sort of a bit self-effacing about their story. Oh yeah, I'm not that interesting. But scratch beneath the surface, and I think everyone is. I completely agree.
And I think that's a really interesting point to start on, is around the importance of stories and how we talk about ourselves, and how actually, and maybe we can dive into this in the theory of WorkJoy, is one of the things that I really think about is to get joy at work, we need to understand our story and where joy fits into it, and who we are, and how we do things, and what some of that history and our background and our story really means to us.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit, if you can, around when people are thinking about this, I've got a really boring story, they're in that zone, or they're like, oh yeah, no, my one is always, why would anyone be interested in that? It's like ancient history, some of the stuff I talk about. And I'd just be really interested from you to think about, what are some of the benefits, or why are stories so important in the world of work?
I guess to come back to your first point about that why don't we believe in our own story? I think we feel, is that curse of knowledge, isn't it? We feel like because we know it, no one else is going to be interesting. Because I've played that over in my head before, and so therefore it's not that interesting. But we don't have the same outside perspective, and we don't have the same experiences as someone else. So I think it's often the case that we are looking at it from our own point of view, and that's not helpful. And mix into that the fact that the brain is this incredible storyteller. I mean, it's just churning all the time, making stuff up. And if there are gaps in our knowledge or experience, we'll just fill them with stories. And so if we're telling ourselves a negative story that I'm not that interesting, well, guess what? Your story probably becomes not that interesting when you tell it. It is quite reinforcing. So, I would say that that's the first thing to think about, is about what self stories are you telling yourself? What self stories are you telling yourself? What stories are you telling yourself? What are those, that self dialogue that's going on, and how is that impacting and affecting both the story you believe about yourself, but also the one you're projecting out into the world? And then to come on to your other point about why is it important for business? I mean, I just think it's because it's such a pervasive part of who we are as human beings. If your business is human led and it's a human based business, so I guess you could probably argue, even if it isn't, if it's some sort of algorithm, you probably use story as well. But if it's human, if it involves humans, it involves stories, because that's the way we think and see the world. So if you're not paying attention to the stories in your business, the stories that your people tell about your business and about themselves, I think you're really missing out on not just a trick, but something quite fundamental about your people and your business and brand.
Yeah. And it's really interesting that you talk about brand. So I'm going to pick up on this one, because I think it's so relevant to businesses now. Is if you have a great brand, but the people don't talk about it or talk about the story of the brand in the right way or connect their story to the brand, it somehow doesn't have the same impact as if you have those things joined together.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's kind of like that whole self thing, isn't it? That, when we bring our whole selves to work, we are much more able to achieve what the great things at work. It's the same if the brand doesn't connect to me as a human being, but allow me to have my place within it as my own story. I think there's a disconnect, and that means that the brand isn't as being as effective as it could be, and therefore you don't get sort of brand advocacy from your employees. And if your employees don't want to talk about your business, why should anyone else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so let's
Did I answer that question? I can't.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure I did.
And I dig into the point about stories and the stories that are in our head. And I'm really interested about the stories that are in our head versus the truth or versus another perspective. So I know that there's lots of things that I tell myself that are a slightly, again, we talked about this at the beginning, you come from a bit of a drama background. I come from a bit of a drama background. Sometimes they are an over dramatized version of what's really going on in the world.
Yeah.
And when that happens in my head, things get out of hand and I can't deal with things well. So there's something there about how do we recognize that and what can we do about that? Because that for me is something that can lead to a lot of work gloom rather than a lot of work joy, is when we're in that position.
Ask that question again.
I know that question was like the most random running round question.
I was going to say, how many questions are in that question?
How many questions
can I have one at a time, please?
So you can. So let me reword it into something that actually makes sense. I think I got lost in my head, which happens quite a lot in my own story. So the stories in our head, versus the facts or the truth, and facts and truth are always from a different perspective.
Yeah.
How can we, if you, you might not have an answer to this, but if you do, how can we help ourselves determine the difference between the truth and the story that goes on in our head?
Okay. Well, I think it's the same as how we determine whether a news report is fake news or realism. You have to validate it. You have to verify. If you are, it's that feedback loop, isn't it? It's that whole thing about are you getting regular and frequent feedback about not just your performance, but about your story. If you have this inflated sense of self or a deflated sense of self, is that what other people experience? Because we can't see ourselves. The thing is that with the story engine that we've got going in our brain, we are experiencing ourselves as a kind of central character in this narrative. But unfortunately, we've been programmed, I guess, is the only way I can describe it. With it sounds quite sinister, but we've got this story route that's sort of constantly playing in our head. This almost 3-act structure that we're running through, that we've learned through school, that is reinforced by culture and society, and probably is partly to do with the way that our brain is wired for story. So we're sort of seeking for these dramatic moments, and looking for conflicts, tensions, and experiences. Therefore, it's very difficult to tell what is real and what isn't, because fiction and fact are so carefully intertwined, I would say. So yeah, if you are unsure about your story and unsure about the story you're telling yourself and whether it's true, you have to get you might be an unreliable narrator. You might be someone you can't trust.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing, isn't it? And I love the idea of getting the feedback on that, to verify, to check it out. And often I ask somebody, like I would phone up you and go, am I going crazy, or is this what's going on? And is what's going on in my mind actually happening? Because if you get that sense, so someone can either talk you down from the ledge of like going into some overthinking nightmare, or say to you, I think there probably is some truth in that, Beth, you need to work on it. There's different things that you can do. But the worst bit is leaving it in your head.
Well, absolutely, because if you leave it in your head, it's got room to create and room to just make stuff up. This whole idea that if we don't have enough information, the brain defaults to negatives. And, that's the same, if you're reading body language and you're not getting a full signal, you're kind of going, oh, I don't trust that person. I don't, it's the same in the story world. If there's a gap in information, we want to close that gap. Our brain just wants to go, right, let's close it. And generally we'll just close it with negative stuff because that's who we are. We're lovely. This is about joy, right? This is all about joy. Okay. We do go into work gloom, as you say. But it comes back to think about those Olympians I was talking about. I've sat down with them and listened to their story, and they not just that generic, oh, my story is not that interesting, but they'll gloss over certain parts of their life. And you go, whoa, hold on. Tell me a little bit more about that struggle or that moment. And they just don't, because they're so used to it. And because, for example, these are elite athletes, so they're working at a certain level and training to them just becomes routine. I'm sat there going, no, a real person doesn't go through that or do that. Let's sit in that for a moment, because your audience, the people around you listening, won't have experienced that and won't know what that's like, and will find that fascinating.
Yeah. And I see so many people beyond athletes, just loads of people going really quickly over some of the biggest, most exciting bits of their story.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I've been through this process myself, and you know what I do. I do a lot of facilitation, a lot of coaching, some kind of keynotey things. I love to be standing on a stage talking to people. And I, for many years, didn't tell a massive part of my story. I just didn't talk about it at all. And that was the stuff that I started my life kind of in the acting world, in the theatre, in music, in that kind of stuff. Because I transferred into the professional world, into kind of corporate world, I thought that story wasn't relevant. And it's really interesting now, because when I tell people that now, they go, oh, now I get you.
All of your pieces fall into place.
Yeah, they suddenly go, that was the bit of the jigsaw that I didn't understand about you, Beth. And I'm like, oh, I deliberately for like 15 years didn't say anything about that.
But again, I think I think what's happened is, and I don't know if this is true, but it feels like sort of brand consultants, for want of a better word. People have told you, well, you stick to the professional stuff. If you do this out of work, don't talk about that because it's not really relevant. Well, nonsense. It doesn't matter what you've done or what you do out of life. It's all part and parcel of who you are. And this separation between work self, home self is not only stupid. I think it's dangerous, because and as someone who's been through it and has actually got to the point where the separation caused a snap, it's unhealthy. So actually, your past and your training and your experiences in the theatre are all incredibly valid. I mean, it's so naive to think that those tools wouldn't be useful in other places. I mean, I have worked with individuals who were previously professional theatre makers, stage managers, performers, and watched them in action. And for all their gorgeous faults, I mean, it's not a perfect world. There is a discipline that comes out of working in theatre, because there is a date. There is a date when the curtain is going to go up, and no matter what, you have to hit that date. There's no, otherwise it's a ridiculous amount of money. So there's no moving away, and so that's a project thing. But also, everyone knows their role. You might, help a little bit out with other people. We know what we're about. We sort of feel comfortable in theatre. But it doesn't. You're not working in isolation. So I think there are certain things from a past, and I've gone on to a theatre trip now. That's very easy, isn't it? Yeah. But I think there are certain things about our past, and it doesn't matter what that is. There's always going to be transferable skills or transferable knowledge or behaviours that are relevant to our current story and that we tell.
Yeah, and owning that and being able to talk about that can be really powerful.
Yeah, and I think that's where I think I've come in, is because I help people see the bits that are worth telling or that are interesting to a wider audience. Quite often with clients, if I'm working in the one-to-one space on how to shape your story and how to share your story, it's all about, well, what is the event you're sharing this out, or what is the site? Is it a website? Is it a blog post? Is it a video? Is it a conference? Okay, what's the narrative? What's the message that you're trying to drive home in this moment? And therefore, the parts of your story that are relevant to that message will be the bits that we mine and bring to the fore. The other stuff doesn't disappear, but it's just not as important as those key moments.
So let's go into that, because I think this is where people get really interested, is how, and it's really hard because obviously if you're working one-to-one with someone, you go really deep into understanding them, their background. I'm just wondering, do you have some suggestions for if people are looking at having a story that they're ready to tell, if people are there wanting to go and do a bit of a presentation or get really good at introducing themselves, which I know loads of people, it's just that whole, when they get, the dreaded go around the table, introduce yourselves, what do you actually say? And I always end up saying something stupid and trying to make people laugh. I'm like, why did I do that? But what are some of the tips or techniques you could suggest that will help people understand which bits to pick out?
Well, they're clearly not the bits that I started this podcast saying. That's for sure. I didn't really, show, don't tell. Well, I didn't do that. Practice what you preach. No, didn't do that. But if I was working with someone else, I would say that it's actually incredibly simple. And what's fascinating to me is that we've almost educated ourselves out of storytelling because the workplace feels like they don't belong there, when in fact they are just part and parcel. So, the whole thing about beginning, middle, and end, they are, if in a good story, a story that sort of is compelling and draws us in, each one of those has a specific function. So a beginning is generally about context setting and about background, but also about perhaps I was going to say unrequited love, but no, not that. Yeah, an unfulfilled desire, something that's missing, a challenge, or something that was a lack. We want to create a gap in that moment, so that the middle of the story, where we talk about getting through the journey, the struggle, the challenge, through this moment, we can sort of talk about how we try to bridge the gap that was created by that lack. And then the end of the story is all about the resolution. Where are you now? How far have you come? Was it indeed the gap you thought it was, or was it something else? So if you were going to introduce yourself, you might talk about, I always thought I wanted to be an actor. My struggle was I wasn't very good at acting. But actually, my end result is I took some of those skills and used them in a different way. I took the things that theatre gave me, which was a really strong understanding of how stories work and how they're shared with an audience of, potentially thousands, and how you can distill that through presence, through structure, through the sort of art of finding the right details. And I've applied that to a world. So it's very simple, beginning, middle, end, challenge, struggle, resolution. But what I'm doing is distilling the very kind of key points out. But I think the starting place, if you want to know which key points which was your question, wasn't it? Which key points to find, or how to find the key points, you need to find that gap to begin with. Because if you find that gap, or a perceived gap that you can create, that immediately hooks your audience in and makes them go, oh, I wonder what's going to happen now. I wonder what happened. I wonder how they got to this point, or whether they fulfilled that or not.
I love that. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I didn't know that that's what you were going to say. I thought you were going to say, find out what the resolution is and, work back from there. But actually working out what the gap was and then the story around it, I can see how that would be more compelling, because people love a story of like a struggle, or, if we think about all films I've ever watched, there's some kind of struggle in it. If you think about, great stories, great books, you're waiting to find out how they're going to overcome this massive challenge or something that you can see coming. So I love that. That's really interesting.
And I think the other thing that, to your point there, it is the how, or it is the why. It's very rarely the what that we're looking for in a story. We know, because we've been programmed by Hollywood and Broadway, West End theatres, all the rest of it, there's generally this pattern that happens, and we sort of know where it's all going. It doesn't really matter. Even when it's a twist, we still know that, even it's like there's going to be a twist. That's a convention. It's a trope. What we're really interested in is, well, why did the twist happen, or why did the person end up where they ended up, and what was the journey to get there? I want to talk about it. Don't worry about who done it. We're not interested in who done it. We're interested in why done it or how done it. Those are far more compelling reasons in this day and age, because we're so used to this pattern of stories and storytelling.
Okay. So we need to think more like a Hollywood director of our own story.
Yeah, I think so. Or yeah, you don't have to be Hollywood. It can be independent if that floats your boat.
Could be,
Or maybe not
niche,
too not
off
too
Broadway.
independent. Yeah. I don't think I would, as much as I love him, I don't think everybody else should communicate like David Lynch. I think it might be a bit kind of difficult.
Yeah. I'm not sure there's that much joy there to be had.
No.
But just while I talk about joy for a minute, because a little while ago you mentioned, we're going down the nego path, slightly around what happens in our brains. And one thing I'm really keen that we don't gloss over when we're talking about WorkJoy is that to be able to have WorkJoy, there will be the other end. There will be work gloom. We are not in the zone of trying to get rid of that stuff, because sometimes you need to feel that stuff to really feel the joy. So it's about understanding what that is and being able to maybe manage it a bit better, or to just know that that's what's happening. So when I know that my brain is overreacting about stuff and filling in the gaps and being dramatic, what's my coping mechanism? What are the things that I'm going to do and act on to make sure it doesn't go down a massive spiral of decline? But that doesn't mean I don't feel it or I don't feel the work gloom. It just means then what do I do to almost get myself back to neutral so I can then work on feeling some joy?
Well, if you think about some of the advice from, Dr. Steve Peters, or even the stuff around Brené Brown, which we were talking about, Brené Brown is talking about vulnerability. Making yourself vulnerable actually is a superpower.
Yeah.
But Steve Peters talks about the idea of talking it out to for the chimp paradox, to really keep talking it out, to exhaust the chimp until you get to a point where actually I don't need to talk about this anymore. And actually, if you're telling a story whilst you're doing that, I believe it, or I've found for personally, it's much more powerful, because you're sharing this journey and you recognize the highs and lows, and you're not glossing over. One of the things I always talk to when I'm talking to clients about presentations, for example, or pitches, they always leave out the conflict. They always leave out this. They always leave out the meat of the story, because they don't want to admit that anything's wrong or has been wrong, or it's been difficult to achieve certain things. They want to make it look all wonderful and easy. And I'm like, well, that's not interesting. It's more interesting to a potential client, say you were pitching for some work. It's more interesting to know that you have overcome barriers and difficulty, and that you did it successfully, rather than to just gloss over and go, yeah, everything was brilliant, we're a fantastic organization, or I'm a fantastic individual. That conflict is the heart of story. It's what moves things forward. So if we ignore that in ourselves, of course we're going to get into work gloom, because we're sort of in this cycle. But if you acknowledge, I believe, if you acknowledge the difficulty, if you acknowledge the conflict, you can start to do something about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that thing, I also, if you are in that situation where you are pitching or doing something and it seems like everything was shiny, I think as a customer of that pitch, I'd be sitting there thinking, are they a bit lightweight? Do they understand the complexities of our organization, or the challenge of working with all these different stakeholders? So it could actually be a negative against you versus the positive of seeing how you would overcome some of these things. So I totally get that.
I think it's a trust thing as well. Sorry to interrupt. I think it's a trust thing. I think I don't trust someone who's perfect. I don't trust an event that's perfect. I like to know a bit of vulnerability. I like to know that there's something behind it. And I think if something is, I often talk about the fact that nobody likes a lottery winner because they got it too easy. Do you know what I mean? We want our millionaires / rich people to have grafted and to earned it. We don't just want it.
Yeah. And this is really interesting, because it's one of the things that I was thinking about when creating the WorkJoy podcast is, people ask me, oh, do you edit them afterwards? And I say, no, we add on the my introduction and my end. But unless something disastrous happened, which has happened a couple of times, the whole thing's cut out and we've had to redo it and piece two bits together, the conversations come out as they happen.
Yeah.
Because I believe, and different people have different opinions on this, but I believe that perfection isn't all that interesting.
No, it's not.
So editing it to its little bit. So I love the fact that we talk over each other occasionally and that we laugh and you go, Beth, I don't understand the question you just asked me. Because that's how conversations happen in real life.
Human beings being human. Wow. Crikey. What's that got to do with work?
Yeah. And I do think, and we're going to go off a totally different level here, and I will bring us back in about 2 minutes, but let me go here first.
Okay.
Is the shiny world of social media often pitches this like kind of perfect view of life, as in, oh, look what I've achieved, what I've done, but you only ever see the end of the story on social media. You don't see the hours and hours of hard graft that go into it. But I think it convinces us all that everyone else has got it easy and we're the only ones struggling.
Yeah, I know. It's so one of our clients who we helped, write their website and do their social media. He's a personal trainer, and he was my personal trainer. It's not that he didn't do a very good job. It's just that I wasn't very good at being trained at the time. just to, I'm not the chiseled specimen or anything like that. Don't worry. But he revealed to me a secret about himself that he's only just recently put on social media. He was trying to do everything perfect on his social media, and we were trying to encourage him to tell more of his story. And a big part of his story was he's an ex-offender. He did something very stupid when he was young, and he went away for a very short amount of time, went to prison, but has reformed, has gone and now is studying for his PhD. He's a brilliant trainer. He into food nutrition, and has made a real success of his life. And he has finally put that out there, and that's the post that everyone is talking about, that everyone is focused on. They're like, how brave of you to do that. I'm so glad you shared that. This is exactly what the system should be doing. It should be reforming people and helping them to move forward. If he'd have chosen to try and be perfect all the time and hide that, he would constantly be feeling, oh, someone's going to find out about this. Someone's going to find out. It's only several clicks away. It's only information. Instead, he's used it and said, no, this is part of my whole story. This is actually this is the conflict of my story. I could have had a very, very different path, but I didn't.
And like, I'm already intrigued and fascinated and want to find out more about them. Like, I want to go and find out, because that's such a, sorry to say it, because it's like, it sounds like I'm being super cheesy, but it's a great story.
Yeah, it is. And it's why it's a good story as well is because it has a happy ending. It has an ending where the individual recognized something about themselves and tried. I mean, he really tried to battle through it, and went through difficulties and has come out the other end. But it wasn't easy. It was difficult. But he is now not shying away from that. Let's hide that part of myself. It's like you with your theatre. You're not hiding it anymore. You're sharing it with us.
And now when I say that, I'm like, why on earth wouldn't I have talked about that?
Don't be ashamed of being in theatre.
Don't be ashamed of being an ex-lovey. It's
an ex-lovey.
Fine.
You're never an ex-lovey. Never an ex-lovey.
I'm still a massive lovey. And what's interesting is, like, 20 years into my career now, in a more, well, not corporate now, but I do work with a lot of corporates, is I now, looking at it in reverse, understand how important that part of my story is for what I do now.
Yeah.
So, like, hello, when I stand on a stage in front of 2,000 people and present to them, did the 15 years at drama school help me to do that?
Maybe.
Duh. Maybe.
You were at drama school for 15 years.
Yeah, nearly, yeah. I know.
Wow,
I'm still not that good.
You lie. You know you are.
Yeah, well. And I think these are the things, is sometimes we don't understand our story or the impact of it until we really take some time to look at it and to understand that. And one of the things that I talk about now is, like, what are your superpowers and where did they come from? And I say it to some people sometimes. I share that I think one of my superpowers is that when I'm on a stage, or when I'm in front of a group of people, I can do what I call thinking and talking at the same time. And when you're a facilitator, that's a really useful skill to have. But I didn't develop it in anywhere of my corporate roles. I developed that from when I started off, when I was like 5 years old, learning scripts and learning to improvise and all of those things that you have to do when you do drama-y things.
Yeah.
But you would never say to a corporate person who works in L&D as a trainer or facilitator, what you need to go is to go and do some really basic drama school lessons.
Yeah.
Although it would be massively helpful.
It would. I think it would be helpful for anyone, to be honest with you. It's improv in particular, I'm a big fan of. I took some improv lessons not that long ago. I decided that I went through a bit of a crisis of confidence in terms of just standing up in front of people, that sort of stuff. And this is about 6-7 years ago. And went and did a 8-week, 10-week improv course, and it was the most liberating thing. And nobody there wanted to be an improv performer. They were all doing it to boost their confidence or improve their presentation skills. And I was like, this is it. It's really, really helpful.
I love that. I would totally go and do something like that. It'd be amazing. It's just bringing me back to another point, which I had written down and circled before, because you mentioned it around vulnerability. And I think the example of the person you're working with there, your client, is an amazing version of how do you get vulnerable and how that really helps people connect with your story. And I too am a big fan of kind of Brené's work on vulnerability and how it's something that we really admire when we see it in other people, and we're really hooked and love it. But when we think about it for ourselves, we see it as a weakness. And it's one of those, I think we've got some stuff wrong in our brains about that.
Yeah. I do agree. I think it's shame, isn't it? It comes back to the stuff around shame, is that, the stuff that we perceive as shameful, other people just go, it isn't. It's something you've lived through. It's something you've had to struggle with. And so I think there's a shame. There's also relevance. I mean, I do kind of take the point that, it's not going to be the first thing you blurt out. So, oh yeah, my name is Simon. I was abused at blah 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 blah. Something terrible like that. It's it's not the first thing you want to mention. But what I think I would encourage people is to, how do you use those moments of vulnerability to make you not appear more rounded, just be more rounded. To be more human.
Yeah. And that's it, isn't it? It's all about, if you come back to it, it's basically how do people connect? How do humans connect with other humans? And take it right back to that.
And I think it is absolutely, how do we connect to other humans? And we do that through either sharing stories or kind of emitting stories. I'll often talk about the fact that a story is being told whether you are telling it or not. So if you turn up somewhere, stand on a stage, and you've got a slide behind you that is data, and you've got a monotone voice, and you're just reading off facts. Well, your audience is telling a story. They're telling a story about your performance, but they're also telling a story about your facts, because you're leaving them out there without actually shaping them or sharing them in a way that engages and also drives someone towards a specific answer. So stories are the people's brains are being. There's always being a story is always being told. It's whether you are telling it as the person speaking or whether the listener is telling it for you.
Ooh, like.
So I think
there's a whole podcast just on that.
There is.
Just you've just blown my mind slightly.
But again, that's why for businesses, if they don't tell their brand story or their employer brand story effectively, then the competition will. You think about when someone has a choice of going to work somewhere, they're not just looking about, is this job right? It's about the story that's being told about that organization. So yeah, they can go on to, what's that website you go on to look at?
Glassdoor.
Glassdoor, that's it. You can look on Glassdoor, but you can read through all those reviews. They are part of the components that will tell a story about that organization, but also the website will tell a story. The branding will tell a story. The section on diversity and inclusion will tell a story. It's all there. And so if the employer isn't shaping that story effectively and going, this is what we are as an employer, and this is how we stand, and this is how that reacts and impacts our employees, and it's all sort of, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, for to use a silly phrase. That one again. You know what I mean? If the employee, if so, in the work I've done around employer branding and storytelling, employer brand storytelling, some people will just want to tell the story straight away. We've got this story, we want to know how to tell it. And you scratch the surface and you find that actually they haven't done any of the work with their employees to understand, is that actually the story of the brand story of the organization? Because the employee's experience is very different. And then you get this kind of conflict between the story that's being told by the organization at this very glossy, lovely brand, and then on Glassdoor, 10 negative reviews because management were horrible, blah, 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 blah. It's all got to be holistic. I don't know why I got onto that subject.
We were just talking about, like, it was because I think I couldn't ask a question because my mind was just totally blown by you're either telling the story or someone is making up the story in their head because you haven't told it in the right way.
Thanks for reminding me.
And it was just a really interesting thing is if you don't tell your story, someone will fill in the blanks.
They will. They will,
and
indeed.
So surely it's better that you narrate your own story in the right way than someone else to fill in the blanks about you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, love it. Just a couple of thoughts again, and just reflecting back on some of the things you talked about. I think loads of people around the vulnerability factor will totally feel that. So I know I felt it. And also, I love the fact that you talked about, as a professional storyteller, as somebody who has worked in this world, that you had a crisis of confidence and didn't feel like you could go and do it. And I love that you're able to be open and vulnerable about that, because I think people always assume that because you do this kind of job, or because I do the kind of job I do, we don't feel that stuff sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it wasn't about 8, as I say, it was 7 or 8 years ago now. Yeah, I just didn't want to be in front of large groups of people. I was quite happy in a small workshop setting, and then I did this improv thing, which again was quite helpful because it kind of freed me up to go, oh, hold on, we're all just making it up all the time. It doesn't matter. Don't get so about it all. And then I kind of helped myself and re-educated my brain and retrained my brain to tell a different story, to think about things about the story I've been telling myself about that number, groups of 15, not above that, I don't want to do that. That was a story that I'd hooked into and started to believe. So I rewrote that story and started going, well, actually, what's the positive side of talking to larger groups of people? Well, if there's a room full of 500 people, social convention generally means they're not going to shout at you or question you. So you can just say anything. And all of a sudden, it sort of unlocked something. And I remember being at an event, I think it was at the Guildhall, and there were hundreds of people there. And all the speakers were running, being very, very nervous. And I'm just sort of sat there going, yeah, all right. And someone went, why do you look so zen and calm? I said, because there's nothing I can do about it now. I can either leave and not go on stage, or I can go on stage and talk and just be fine with the fact that that's the number of people. But that was all about me rewriting that story, definitely.
Yeah. And it's that thing I think is really important. It's like the stories we tell ourselves again, isn't it? It's like, what is the internal narrative and how is that influencing what you do or how you feel? And is that what you want it to continue to do? Because if you don't, you have to take some action with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yes, I agree.
I thought you were going to come up with some amazing point.
Well, no, I wasn't. It's just that it's interesting to me because this subject is obviously my world, and it's what I do. But because you use the word narrative, and I was like, oh, that reminds me about the fact that we've got these terms, narrative, story, and storytelling, and we use them interchangeably. And I'm like, I'm not sure they're the same thing. I don't think they are the same thing. And in fact, I would encourage people to think of them differently. So I think the way you used narrative then was right. It was about the narrative is that sort of overarching story in your head, the shape of the story, the destination of the story in your head, that sort of puts you on a trajectory. The story is the shape of it. It's the structure. It's the way we actually shape our communications and the way we connect to people. And then storytelling is the how. It's the language we use. It's the physicality. It's the way we engage an audience. And those three things are becoming blurred. So often, I hear a lot of people talk about those three things, and then calling something that isn't storytelling quite often, and it just infuriates me because you go, no. A story isn't for every occasion. Storytelling isn't for every occasion. The fire in the building, no, don't want to know any story about it or about its personal history and relationship. Please. No, I don't want to get all some metaphorical thing. No, just exits and out. That's it. So it isn't for every occasion. But I do think that language is important. We are in danger of, in business, of thinking that storytelling is a fad, or stories are a fad, or indeed narrative is a fad, because we are calling things a story when it's not. We are
Yeah.
saying, let's talk about the narratives when those things aren't actually narratives. And we're using everything. Oh, it's great storytelling, and going, well, it wasn't really. It was just two dots on a screen. I think it was great storytelling from the audience because they made a story in their brain, but actually you could have worked harder on that and really made it great storytelling, for example. So I'm a big passionate believer that we should start thinking about these things slightly different and being careful around our language. I don't know why I feel the need to just go on and on about that.
Because I made you, basically.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm really interested in is how things change based on what we label them, and I think labels are really interesting. And I love the way that you just broke that down for me, because I'm going to really think about that around what's the narrative, what's the story, and what's storytelling. Because I agree, I think a lot of people use interchangeable, and I also hear a lot of the, oh, are we talking about storytelling again?
Yeah.
When actually we might not be. It's storytelling
No.
might be the way we get the message across, but we're not talking about storytelling. We're talking about business strategy, or we're not talking about storytelling. We're talking about our plans. So there are that for me has been really super helpful. And on that point, I think due to timing, although we could obviously continue this conversation forever, I'm not sure everyone would want to listen to it forever.
True.
And we probably will continue this conversation afterwards. But I would just love, if it's okay with you, to move you to some quick fire questions if you are up for it.
Okay.
Are you ready? Like, okay.
Probably
not really. The story I'm telling myself now is no. The story I'm telling you is yes.
Yes, correct.
Don't worry, they're not too complicated.
Okay.
First question is, for you personally, what is always guaranteed to bring you a little bit of work joy?
I think it has to be surprising and delighting someone I work with, a client. So if they come with an expectation, for example, I run an event and they're kind of, oh, it wants to be like that. And then I do something really extra and they go, oh, that was amazing. If they're pleased and delighted by it, that really brings me joy. So lighting somebody else's eyes up.
Yeah. Love that. And I can tell you that you've actually made that happen for me. So I'll give you the little story here. So for those of you who don't know, and in fact, why would anyone know, although you alluded to it at the beginning of the podcast, is Simon is the amazing producer of the WorkJoy Jam and composed the little ditty that is our... You're like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. That was ages ago. That was pre-season 1.
Gosh, it was, wasn't it?
And this is season 2. But that, for me, I was so excited to have a newly composed, totally special, really joyful theme for the WorkJoy Jam. And so you've definitely given me that. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a WorkJoy back again. I love it. I love it. And loads of people comment on it as well, because it is really joyful. That little bit of music. So thank you for that. And amazing composition skills. You see, that's something you haven't even talked about, the fact that you're a composer as well.
We haven't got time to talk about that.
We haven't got time for that. We'll do that another day. Okay, cool. Question 2. What book are you currently reading?
Oh, I've normally got about 3 on the go. Okay, so I've just finished a book called Anything Goes, which is a history of the musical on Broadway, but it's actually the history of the musical full stop. So it starts back in the 1700s, talking about oh gosh, what's it called? Forget it. It was So that I've just finished that. But the book I'm reading now is a novel. It's called The Swans of Fifth Avenue by Melanie Benjamin, and it's about the group of women. And it's actually the second book I've read on this subject in the last year and a half, maybe. The other one was called Swan Song, and it's about a group of women that surrounded Truman Capote in the 1950s and 60s. And into the 70s, and how he kind of betrayed them all. I'm fascinated by the subject. It's really, the first book I read was called Swan Song. I can't remember who wrote that. I'm so sorry. So I'm reading another one to see if this is the same story but a different take on it.
Oh, amazing. Sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm, obviously as a fellow theatre nerd, I'm like, oh, Anything Goes. I could totally...
Oh yeah, it's great.
Okay.
It's great.
Question 3. What in your life have you had like a really great bit of advice that someone has given you that you always find yourself coming back to?
Okay. This is easy because it's a piece of advice I pass on all the time to other people, and it sounds awful, but it's not meant to sound awful. And the piece of advice is care less, which is, and it's difficult to do because we put these stakes in the ground and we build things up to be far, far more serious than they are. Care less about that thing. Care more about something that's more important, and care less. And it's often to speakers or people who are trying to structure a story, and they're sort of saying, "Well, no, I get very nervous in front of a crowd." I said, "Well, it's because you're worrying too much about your performance. Care less about that. Care less about this thing, and care more about getting your story across." So yeah, care less.
I love that.
Which sounds really negative and horrible, but it's not. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be really, really positive. And I found it incredibly positive, which is a kind of like, oh, why are you worrying about that? Care less about that. Yeah. Don't be careless, but care less.
Care less about the stuff that isn't important.
Yeah.
The stuff that won't actually really make a difference, or the stuff that's worrying you, but it's just the story in your head. Love it. Care less. Final quickfire question for me is, what bit of really super practical, easy to do advice could you give to our listeners that could help them today, tomorrow, the next day get a bit more work joy in their lives?
I think it is, don't ignore the stories don't ignore the story that is. I'm going to edit this bit,
don't, because we just talked about, we don't edit.
No, it's what I'm trying to say is, don't ignore the stories around you and within you. I know we talked a little bit about how do you reconcile sometimes if you're hearing a story, but it might not be a true story that you're hearing or a true story that you're seeing in front of you, but don't ignore them. Pay attention to them and question them. Approach a story as a kind of something to be curious about. Quite often, as I said, no, I'm changing my mind now. I'm not really. I'm expanding upon it. Quite often, is kind of related to the careless thing. Is if we don't have enough information about something, our brain, our storytelling brain, will make something up. We'll try and close that open-ended loop in our brain to go, I must make sense of this. I must create order of this. If you recognize that's what your storytelling brain is doing. So recognize when your brain is telling you a story about what's going on around you, and your brain is telling you a story about what the stories you're telling yourself. That is incredibly powerful, because otherwise you can slip into the gloom by making rubbish up and telling a disaster story when actually there's no story to tell at all, because no one's really thinking about the situation you're in. You're probably just placing a lot of it on there yourself. That was a very rambly way of saying something quite simple.
I think it is actually a really simple thing. I think it's really hard to do.
Yeah,
so I think it's one of those that it is simple yet difficult. So it's just really learning to recognize that within yourself and to stop and challenge and think about it. It also totally relates to something I talk to a lot of people about when I'm coaching people, is this idea that you're still worrying about this, but the other person in that situation, do you think they've even thought about it once since that situation? And I reckon 80 to 90% of the time people go, well, no, they probably haven't. It's like, okay, so why are we still worrying? It probably fits in with your careless thing. Why am I still worrying about this?
I think
why is it still there?
I agree with that completely. And I think the thing for me is that knowing how your brain works with story and understanding the brain's relationship to stories and storytelling as techniques and methods within our brain can help us do that. Because as soon as we recognize that, oh, this thing in my brain is an incredibly powerful storyteller, it's making all this stuff up. As soon as we recognize that, we can go, okay, that's just the storyteller. Steve Peters, it's just the chimp. This is just the storyteller trying to make these connections where there are none.
Yeah, love it. Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you for being a guest and obviously being our wonderful producer.
You are welcome.
Where can people find out more about you and your work and how to get in touch with you?
Yes, so I said at the beginning of the podcast that I started a company called Grow the People 10 years ago. That company no longer exists. It's now called, so I should probably tell you that. We are called Iambic Creative. You can find us at iambic.agency online, and on most of the usual social places we're also at that too.
Brilliant. And I love it called Iambic because it just makes me think of iambic pentameter.
That's correct.
And which is a poetry type, isn't it? And,
it is, yeah.
But it's just a wonderful thing to say.
Yeah, it is nice. It's an iamb is a meter of time. So a da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. An iambic pentameter is 5 of those meters. Yeah.
See? Love it. We've totally just nerded out at the end of the podcast. Nerded out. Thank you, Simon. It's been wonderful to talk to you. You've given me lots of work joy having the conversation.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you all for listening to that episode with Simon, and thank you to Simon for being one of my wonderful guests. And as we said there, for being the person who makes the podcast really work through his amazing production and composition. There are so many things I could take away and talk about in Simon's conversation, but a couple of things that really stood out for me was the first one was actually really defining the difference between a narrative, a story, and storytelling. And that's really helped me in my head when I'm thinking about helping organisations and how they communicate things, when I'm thinking about how I do things myself, when I'm doing presentations or keynotes or whatever it is. So I'm really loving that idea that the narrative is this overarching story. The story itself is the shape, it's the structure. And the storytelling then is how we tell that story, how we engage the audience with it. And that structure in my mind has really, really helped. I also love the idea that humans love the struggle, they love the conflict. And how do we talk about that more? Because I don't know about you, but I'm one of these people who I tend to brush over those things and work to the solution or where we've got to or the positive stuff. And actually the conflict is often where the real magic is. So being a bit more open to that. And this idea that the more vulnerable we get, the more open we are, the easier it is for our audiences to engage with us. I really hope you enjoyed this episode of the WorkJoy Jam with Simon Arrowsmith. I know I really enjoyed recording it for you. If you do want to find more about Simon, his links are going to be in the show notes and in the bottom of our social media posts, so click on those to find out more about Simon and his work at Iambic. If you want to find out more about Create WorkJoy, head over to our website www.createworkjoy.com, where you can find out more about what we do and our programs, like my WorkJoy Way 16-week coaching program, enabling the people who come on it to really deeply create and cultivate some more joy in their working lives. And also Club WorkJoy, a growing community of people who really want to do the same things about joy and getting that in their working lives too. That one's coming soon, but go and have a look and sign up to the waiting list. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Do go and have a listen to some of the other podcasts and follow us on social media at Create WorkJoy, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Thank you.